So as we share this time together this evening, remembering the death of Jesus for us, and to share the bread and the wine, which symbolize his body broken and his blood poured out, I'd like to focus on this phrase Jesus said, "This cup is the new covenant which in my blood, which is poured out for you." Now, when Jesus spoke about the bread they were sharing, describing it as his body given for us, we understand he was referring to his suffering and ultimate death on a Roman cross on our behalf. But what did he mean when he described the cup from which they all drank as the new covenant in his blood? Clearly this was a further reference to his imminent and bloody death, because he spoke of his blood being poured out for them. But why did he speak in terms of a new covenant? People rarely speak of covenants these days, do they? It's a rather old-fashioned legal term for a binding agreement between two parties. For example, in the deeds of our house in Woodchurch, there is a covenant mentioned between Hillreed Homes, the property developer, and South Eastern Electricity concerning a mains power cable that runs under our land. And it sets out the obligations and responsibilities of both parties in the event of the need to access it. And in the Old Testament, as Matthew reminded us this morning, there are numerous references to covenants made between God and his people. In some instances, God unconditionally promises he will do something for them. So, for example, we're going to have a bit of a tour tonight. In Genesis 6, with the account of the flood, or before the flood happened, in 6:18, God says, "I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you." And that's a promise that he makes. There's no conditions to it. This is what is going to happen. And after the flood in chapter 8, chapter 9, verse 12, this is what he says. "And God said, 'This is the sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I've set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth.' So God said to Noah, 'This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth.'" And that is a promise that he made. He's going to do this, or not going to do it, and the rainbow is a sign of that covenant. So there were no conditions attached to it. He just states this is what is going to happen. But the covenant he established with his people when they assembled at Mount Sinai for the giving of the law, later on into Exodus, was conditional. The promise of blessing depended on them keeping their side of the agreement. This was the old, or the first covenant, and this is the one that I believe Jesus was referring to when he spoke of a new covenant, indicating that it would be replaced by a new one in his blood. So let's look briefly at the old covenant and why it needed to be replaced, and then we'll consider the new one that he inaugurated by his death. So the old covenant, the one that I think Jesus had in mind. And You recall we were looking at this in Exodus, well, a while back now. After the Lord had brought the Israelites out of Egypt, he met with them at Mount Sinai. There, through Moses, he set out what he expected of them as they prepared to enter the land he had promised them. And in Exodus 20 through 23, we won't read all of that tonight. It's far too much. Let me just turn it up. So in these 4 chapters, all these obligations and warnings are set out in detail, beginning with the 10 Commandments, as we know. And when Moses had finished explaining what the Lord had said to him, the people responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." So the people were agreeing with what they heard, and they declared that they would obey the Lord. That was their agreement, their ratification of the covenant. And you might want to turn to Exodus 24, because the next day Moses organized a special ceremony to ratify the agreement or the covenant the people had made in promising to obey the Lord in all that he had said. He built an altar at the foot of Mount Sinai, and on it he made burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. And this is probably Exodus 20 to 22, all of the covenant that God set out. And the Israelites responded very decisively with these words, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Then Moses took some of the blood and sprinkled it on the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So that's really where the blood of the covenant comes. And Moses sprinkled, he sort of, I think he had hyssop, and he just sprinkled the animal blood over the people as a symbol of the covenant being made. And of course the people, they went for it. They said, "We will do everything the Lord has said." But he also warned them of punishment if they forsook his commands and followed other gods. And what follows is, we don't often read this, but it follows in chapter 24, verse 9. Let me just read these few verses. Because after this covenant was established, after the blood was sprinkled on the people, Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Now that ought to make you sit up and think, wow, what's happening here? Because we read elsewhere that no one can see God. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God and they ate and drank. This was such an important occasion when he entered into this covenant with his people of promise and blessing and warning. And it's marked with this quite remarkable occasion when 74 of them make their way up the mountain, and it says they saw God in a glorious description. Pavement of lapis lazuli and bright blue as the sky. What an occasion. And God did not raise his hand against these leaders. They ate and drank. They survived. They had this wonderful time with God. And towards the end of his life, towards the end of Moses' life, as the people eventually prepare to enter the promised land, Moses reminds the people of their obligations and promises under the covenant. And this is recorded for us in Deuteronomy. And here the conditionality of the covenant is made abundantly clear. And if you want to flip forward to Deuteronomy 28, Moses has rehearsed all the things that they are to do. And right at the end are the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. Let me just read a few of them. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands that I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. And what follows is a whole string of blessings. And then we get to verse 15. However, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. And from that verse right through to the end of the chapter, it goes on and on and on. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country, and so on. God pronounces curses upon the people if they failed to keep their side of the covenant. Well, I think you might guess what's coming next, because sadly, the Israelites drifted away from God's ways. Even before they reached the promised land, they began grumbling against the Lord to such an extent that he became angry with them, and almost that entire generation that came out of Egypt died in the wilderness as a consequence. God was fulfilling his word. But God was gracious and long-suffering with his wayward people, and eventually they enter and occupy Canaan under the leadership of Joshua, and they have this amazing string of God-given military successes. And they prosper under a series of leaders right up to King David, and this culminated in the great and glorious kingdom Solomon established. And we read of this kingdom, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. That was the absolute pinnacle of Israel's military and success as a nation. They were respected throughout the whole world at that time. But it was downhill after that, wasn't it? As you know, Solomon became obsessed with his wealth and influence, as well as his many wives and concubines. And he and Israel departed from God's ways. There was division in the land, and the people gradually forgot the Lord and turned increasingly to idolatry. And in line with those warnings given by the Lord through Moses, first the northern tribes were carried off into exile, then the southern tribes, and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The dream was over. The people had broken the covenant. Although some of the exiles returned to Israel many years later, the country was now ruled and governed by foreign powers. And I think it remained that way until 1948, when the state, the nation of Israel, was set up after the war. So that's just a summary of how Israel failed to keep the covenant, which is why it should come as no surprise that there was to be a new one. And God knew all about that. He knew his people would stumble and fall, and it was always his intention to establish a new and better covenant with his people, as we know and see from the many prophecies running through the Old Testament. They speak principally of the coming of Messiah, And there's a particularly helpful prophecy in Jeremiah that speaks explicitly of a new covenant, and that's really where we're going this evening. And Jeremiah 31, you probably know this very well. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. I think that's such an amazing prophecy. And for us tonight, I think there are three key elements to what this new covenant is. First of all, it will be internal, written on our hearts and minds by the Holy Spirit. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. How different from the old covenant, which was all to do with sacrificing animals and presenting offerings at the temple. This time it's going to be in our hearts and minds. And it will signify a new relationship with God. Verse 33b, I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. So this inner working of the Holy Spirit reflects a new relationship with God. We're his people. I mean, the people in the Old Testament were his people in a different way. We will know God personally, not through a priest. And lastly, there will be real forgiveness, because the blood of animals could never really deal with sin, because those offerings had to be repeated year after year. And he says, I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. That's a wonderful promise of what was to come. So let's just think about the ratification of the new covenant. So the first one was ratified, as we saw, by the sprinkling of animal blood on the people. This was followed by these regular animal sacrifices of various kinds set out for them in great detail in Leviticus. And these sacrifices had to be repeated year after year because, as we see from Hebrews 9, the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshipper. They were only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. So all these Old Testament procedures and sacrifices and offerings were always, ever going to be temporary until the coming of the new order, the new covenant. And that was established and the new covenant ratified by Jesus during the Last Supper on the basis of his own blood, which, as he said, was to be poured out for them. A sacrifice of infinite worth will be offered once and for all, thereby making the old order of things redundant. And just one last point before we conclude. It is significant that these disciples sitting around the table at the Last Supper were invited to drink the wine that symbolized the blood of the new covenant. Whereas when Moses ratified the first covenant, it was by sprinkling the blood on the people. The latter was external. The new one is internal. They drank the wine representing his blood. It was something that was going to happen inside them, not that was done to them externally. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. That's the new covenant. It's internal. God at work in us. And I've referred to Hebrews 9 because this really does bring it all together. The writer to the Hebrews summarizes the blessings of the new covenant ratified by Jesus' blood. And there's just three things to bring out of that in chapter 9. Let me just read verse 11 to 14 of chapter 9. Having spoken about all the arrangements under the Old Testament, he says, but, in other words, he's saying that was then and now, when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human's hands, that is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, so obtaining eternal redemption. So, have I read it all? No, I need to just read on a bit further. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. So this new covenant, the blood poured out for us, we can experience the true forgiveness of sins. In the Old Testament, there wasn't real forgiveness. They didn't know that in their hearts. The penalties had been paid, but only now can our consciences be cleansed from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. We're cleansed and enabled to serve him. And then in verse 15, for this reason Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. And he speaks of a promised eternal inheritance. That is one of the great blessings. Think about that, an eternal inheritance. His death and resurrection for us, signified by the drinking of the blood, of the cup that signifies his blood. We have an eternal inheritance. It's promised, but it's for sure. And lastly, this sacrifice was once for all. Verse 23, it was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. Now here it is. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. That's a pretty quick run through of the blessings of the new covenant, and that's what we're going to celebrate in just a few minutes as we break the bread and drink the cup together. But before we do that,